Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening. Today I'll be presenting some of the observations of the Naukluft Thrust and its characteristic fault rocks that span about 10 years of fieldwork with student projects from University of Cape Town and McGill University. The Naukluft Thrust is renowned for its incredible expression and outcrop. Here at Sams, in the southwest of the Naukluft Mountains, the fault cuts a sharp, straight, continuous surface through the hills, seemingly oblivious to the distorted sedimentary layers above and below it. Herman Korn and Henno Martin famously called this configuration a double unconformity, and correctly surmised that the upper and lower sediments had been decoupled along the surface and deformed independently. They apparently considered the possibility that this was a thrust, but the reasons for deciding against that interpretation were not specified in their 1959 paper. This led many authors who followed them to try to associate the surface with particular stratigraphic features or to seek stratigraphic explanations for the rock types found along it. The thrust contact is marked by fault rocks with a distinctive orange color, which contrasts sharply to the blue-gray Nama group limestones in the footwall at this outcrop in the Naukluft River just south of the park headquarters. The fault core here contains 1.5 meter thick layer of the most unusual rock, the gritty dolomite, which is unlike any of the sedimentary units above or below and hasn't been reported in any significant occurrence on the other major faults in the Nappe complex. You can see why it's called the gritty dolomite. It's very gritty, and it's nearly 100% dolomite. Coarse white crystals, fragments of dolomite rock, and fine granular to crystalline matrix are all dolomite. In some areas, the more diverse lithic fragments are abundant, but in much of the fault exposure, they are essentially absent. The gritty dolomite is one lithology of a tectonostratigraphy that characterizes the Naukluft Thrust. The oldest detailed description is from Munch in 1978, who called it a blastomyelinite and indicated that it was formed by tectonic working of the surrounding rocks. Soon after, Baer and others reinterpreted Munch's tectonic stratigraphy and replaced the blastomyelinite, a fault rock, with a foreign injection of saline evaporite mush, building on the Korn and Martin model. This paradigm has prevailed for several decades. Miller et al. Provided this summary cartoon, which incorporates most of the same lithologies, and Viola et al. In 2006 explored the ways in which the different components were related and how they recorded deformation. These workers showed that the fault varies extensively from place to place in terms of the presence or absence, thickness, and the stacking order of these fault rock components. This example from the Olive Trailhead turnoff near the park headquarters shows the grayish limestone football rock has taken on strong subhorizontal myelinitic fabric, which has acted as a guide for dolomite alteration. Some of the myelinite is completely altered to a massive yellow dolostone. Multiple thin layers of gritty dolomite cut across the altered myelinite, and the whole package is cut by numerous small steep faults. The gritty dolomite itself is highly variable in structure. Here, a massive example with an undulatory contact to a layer of fault breccia formed by dolostone wall rock fragments, with gritty dolomite forming the matrix to that breccia. In addition to the dolostone wall rock fragments, a major component of the gritty dolomite are single crystal fragments of white translucent dolomite, often well-rounded, which have no clear source in the hanging wall or footwall units. Here we have two examples, one from Naukluft area on the left and the other one from Nazareth on the right. It shows that these crystals grow directly out of wall rock fragments, presumably triggered or facilitated by infiltration of fluids. The field geometries of the gritty dolomite display significant evidence for fluidization. Gritty dolomite is found in fractures in the wall rock and invading the pore space in breccias. Gritty dolomite along the fault plane and in off-fault injections is flow-banded with folded shapes like swirls in a fluid. Fluidization of granular layers is now known to be commonly associated with faults undergoing earthquake slip. This is facilitated by two mechanisms. First, the acceleration of shear in granular layers results in dilation and reduces grain-to-grain contacts, reducing friction on the fault. Second, and most importantly, coseismic friction can produce extreme heating in a fault and cause thermal expansion of pore fluids. This expansion further dilates and suspends the fault gouge, enabling sliding on a cushion of pressurized gas or vapor. Associated with every gritty dolomite layer, we find a thin layer, 0.5 to 2 centimeters thick usually, of micro to nanocrystalline dolomite. We interpret these layers as the coseismic rupture surfaces that heated up until the dolomite thermally decomposed and gave up enough supercritical CO2 to lift, dilate, and suspend all the gritty dolomite layers sitting on top of it. This mechanism of CO2 production during earthquakes has been seen in landslides and inferred in other carbonate-hosted faults, particularly in dolostone-hosted faults. Here in the southeast of the mountains, there are some interesting features that enable us to estimate the size of the earthquakes that occurred on the Naukluft thrust during Cambrian fault activity. At a restraining ramp in the fault, huge fractures opened in the hanging wall and were filled with injected gritty dolomite. In his 2014 master's thesis, Tim Sherry estimated the volume of CO2 gas required to power these injections and found that an earthquake of approximately magnitude 6 would be the minimum size required to form one of these. The true earthquake magnitude was likely bigger, as it wouldn't realistically vent 100% of co-seismically generated gas into one single crack. At these sites where the gritty dolomite is so prominent, the other fault rock components are minor or absent. Returning to the tectonostratigraphy, the massive dolomite member is not always present or continuous, and often displays a thready, weathered surface, which is not unlike many of the adjacent stratigraphic layers of dolostone, but also reflects some fabrics and healed fractures within this crystalline dolostone layer. It is not uncommon to see huge brecciated and healed zones in the massive dolomite and along the interface between massive and gritty dolomite. The calc-myelinite member, as in this example from the Olive Trail, contains a complex microstructure of foliation with a strong grain-shaped preferred orientation, which leads to the identification as myelinite. This one is very fine-grained, with abundant evidence of solution precipitation processes, stylolites, white calcite and dolomite veins, which are often transposed into the shear fabric. The yellowish matte weathering fractures and layers are where dolomite has replaced the calcite, and we did not observe the reverse. These are characteristic of the myelinites in the southern part of the mountains, where the myelinites along the Naukluft thrust are typically thin, 0.1 to 3 meters thick, and gradational to undeformed wall rock. Here's an example of the gradation. In the upper left photo, photo 1, the orange layer is the surface of the brittle fault at the base of the Naukluft thrust tectonostratigraphy, showing the fabric developed in the gray limestone below, and the encroachment by dolomite alteration is only about 10 centimeters down section. Photo 2 shows a more dolomitized site on a little copy near the Lemon Puts farm site, which is capped by a tiny clippa of the Naukluft nappes, beneath which we see about a meter of dolomite-altered calc-myelinite. Here you can see that the brittle fractures cut across the fabric, showing the trend of embrittlement with the dolomitization, since dolomite is so much stronger than calcite at low temperatures. Photo 3 shows the advanced result of dolomitization and embrittlement, a tight web of dolomite-altered fractures and dolomite-altered foliation. There is no offsetting of the high-angle fractures, showing that the alteration hardening has shut down the ductile creep in the former myelinite. Finally, photo 4 shows completely dolomitized rock, possibly former myelinite, as the web of the foliation is still faintly visible on the weathered surface. This rock is a massive white dolomite inside, with no crystallographic preferred orientation, as there was no ductile deformation after dolomite replacement. The myelinites look quite different in the north, where the grain size and layering are coarser and the dolomite is ductilely deformed. Here, the boudinage of thicker dolomite layers shows concurrent deformation of both calcite and dolomite, with brittle fractures only showing up in the larger dolomite boudins. The abundance of white veins in the boudin necks and the strain shadows also shows that dissolution precipitation creep was active during the ductile flow. The myelinites take on a beautiful variety of colors here, in part due to coarse books of chlorite and biotite and a variety of iron oxides that form eddies in the flow. In contrast to the previous example, the dolomite myelinites here in the north do have a strong crystallographic orientation, and the cross-cutting fractures are gone. The myelinites have a gradational contact to more massive dolostone layers, and these layers form boudin trains in the myelinite. The layers of gritty dolomite swirl through the myelinites in places, and sheets of lustrous green chlorite decorate the laminations. The gritty dolomite is present here, but it also looks really different to the appearance in the south. It's very thick, more deeply weathered than at most southern exposures. Some horizons are altered white. Upon closer inspection, the white layers are actually tiny white mineral fibers in pull-aparts within the gritty dolomite, like tiny tension gashes interspersed with selvages of gritty dolomite. These fibers are oblique to the selvages and show opening directions consistent with top to the east-southeast transport. The white fibers are calcite and a distinctively soapy feeling magnesium silicate, brucite, and or talc. This records a stage of deformation at elevated temperature after the formation of the gritty dolomite. The crumbly, sandy effect of the gritty dolomite here may reflect the distributed crystallization of talc and brucite in the matrix, resulting in a friable rock. Previous authors have used fluid inclusions and illite crystallinity to show a temperature gradient from higher temperatures in the north toward lower temperatures in the south. Contrast we show between dolomite ductile conditions in the north, above 400 to 450 degrees, and dolomite brittle conditions in the south, likely below 400 degrees, are completely consistent with the previous work. The patterns at Nazareth in the north suggest ductile deformation at greater than 400 degrees in the mylonites, and syntectonic metamorphism of the gritty dolomite to calcite plus talc suggests that this ductile deformation postdated at least some of the brittle deformation that formed the gritty mylonite. The patterns at Nazareth in the north suggest that ductile deformation at greater than 400 degrees in the mylonites and syntectonic metamorphism of the gritty dolomite to calcite plus talc suggests that this ductile deformation postdated some brittle deformation, at least the brittle deformation that formed the gritty dolomite. The sequence at Nazareth is in contrast to the south part of the thrust, where the trend is always embrittlement and no temperatures greater than 400 are recorded in the fault. In the southwest, neither gritty dolomite nor mylonites are found in the Naukluft thrust. The thrust itself is marked by the famous and striking sharp orange line, which is visible like a bathtub ring high in the hills in the Solms Valley. The fault surface itself is continuous, but on closer examination, the orange layer of dolomite which marks it is locally missing, particularly where both the footwall and hanging wall are shaly. Where present, the dolostone layer is often pretty undeformed, like this 1 meter thick dolomite layer with stylolites and some minor brecciation, with distinctive orange staining creeping up from its base, but grading to a more typical gray buff toward the top that matches the layers farther up in the section in the hanging wall. Finding insignificant evidence for either brittle or ductile deformation in these lenses, I conclude that they are in fact stratigraphic dolomite layers, mostly derived from the Naukluft Nappes, which have been transposed and dragged into the fault, where the fault itself cuts through the shale-dominated section. They don't have significant deformation features because they were only dragged a short distance, and they are still close to the stratigraphy from which they are derived. They don't share a resemblance to the interesting dynamic features seen elsewhere in the Sol dolomite. But the key points that I want to express to you today are that the Naukluft thrust itself displays a clear evolution from ductile to brittle deformation, both in time, that's going forward in time with embrittlement, and in space, with ductile deformation dominant in the north and evidence of brittle deformation dominant in the south. At both sites, there's evidence of continual fluid rock activity during the fault motion. The higher temperatures that are preserved in the north may suggest that the area has been differentially uplifted during or after emplacement of the Nappe complex. The north experienced heating or possible tectonic burial while the fault was active. If correct, this would indicate that the apparently horizontal orientation of the fault is rotated from an originally more north-dipping orientation. The gritty dolomite is unusual, but it was produced in situ from local wall rock material during earthquakes in the Naukluft thrust, and it records coseismic lubrication due to decarbonation from frictional heating. Thank you very much.